The autumn fog rolled thick through the cobblestone streets of Lower Manhattan, carrying with it the familiar sense of coal smoke, horse manure, and the East River's murky waters. 8-year-old Thomas McCarthy pressed his face against the grimy window of his family's third-floor tenement, watching the gas lamps flicker to life in the gathering dusk of October 1898. "Tommy, get away from that window before you catch your death," his mother called from the kitchen, her Irish accent still thick despite 15 years in New York. Margaret McCarthy stirred a thin soup over their small coal stove, the steam barely visible in the perpetually cold apartment. Thomas reluctantly pulled back from the glass, his breath leaving a foggy circle that slowly faded. At 8 years old, he possessed the restless energy of a boy trapped in too small a space, with too little to occupy his mind. His father worked 16-hour days at the docks, his mother took in washing, and his 5-year-old sister Mary spent most days helping their neighbor Mrs. Kowalski with her newborn. "Can I go play outside, Ma?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer. Absolutely not. The streets are no place for children after dark, especially down by those old warehouses. Margaret's tone left no room for argument. "Besides, your father will be home soon and we'll have supper." But Thomas's attention had already wandered back to the window. Beyond the narrow alleyway, past the rows of identical tenement buildings, he could see the skeletal remains of the old warehouse district. Most of the buildings had been abandoned for years, their broken windows like dead eyes staring back at the living city. The adults whispered about those places, crossing themselves when they passed by, but no one ever explained why. That night, after his father Patrick had returned home reeking of sweat and fish, after they'd shared their meager meal of soup and day-old bread, Thomas lay in the narrow bed he shared with Mary. The walls were so thin he could hear the Kowalskis arguing in Polish next door, the Rossi's baby crying downstairs, and somewhere above, old Mrs. Chen's shuffling footsteps as she paced her floor. But there was another sound, so faint he almost missed it, a tinkling melody, like a music box playing far away. Thomas sat up in bed, straining to listen. The tune was haunting, almost familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it before. Mary stirred beside him but didn't wake. The melody stopped abruptly, leaving only the usual nighttime symphony of the tenements. Thomas lay back down, but sleep eluded him. Something about that distant music had stirred a curiosity he couldn't shake. The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. Thomas's mother sent him to fetch milk from the corner market, and he took the long way home, allowing his feet to carry him closer to the abandoned warehouse district than he'd ever been allowed to go. The buildings loomed larger up close, their brick facades blackened with age and soot. Most had been gutted by fires over the years, leaving behind empty shells with gaping doorways and windows. Thomas knew he should turn back, but something drew him forward, down a narrow alley between two particularly decrepit structures. That's when he saw it. In what had once been a loading dock, now partially collapsed and overgrown with weeds, something glinted in the pale morning light. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. Half buried beneath a pile of rotting timber and debris was a small wooden box, ornately carved with faded gilt decorations. He should have run home immediately. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to pretend he'd never seen it. But 8-year-old boys are not known for their good judgment, and this 8-year-old boy had been desperately craving adventure in his cramped, predictable world. Thomas pulled the box free from the debris, brushing away decades of dust and grime. It was heavier than it looked, made of dark wood with intricate carvings of dancing figures around the sides. On the top, barely visible beneath the accumulated filth, was a small brass nameplate. Thomas rubbed it clean with his sleeve, revealing elegant script that read, "William Ashford, 1860. The box had a small brass key protruding from one side. Thomas's hands trembled as he turned it, hearing the familiar click of a music box mechanism engaging. The lid sprang open, and a painted jack-in-the-box popped up, its grinning face somehow both cheerful and sinister in the grey morning light. The melody that began to play was the same one Thomas had heard the night before, drifting through his bedroom window. But now, hearing it up close, he could make out words being whispered along with the tune, so faint they might have been the wind. Round and round the mulberry bush, the children chase the weasel. All fall down in the flames so bright, pop goes the weasel. Thomas slammed the lid shut, his heart racing. The sudden silence felt deafening. He looked around the abandoned alley, half expecting to see someone watching him, but he was utterly alone. The jack-in-the-box sat innocently in his hands, giving no indication of the eerie performance it had just delivered. He should have put it back where he found it. Should have run home and forgotten all about the mysterious toy with its haunting song. Instead, Thomas tucked the box inside his jacket and hurried home, already composing the lie he would tell his mother about where he'd been. Thomas managed to slip the jack-in-the-box into the apartment without his mother noticing, hiding it beneath his thin mattress while she hung wet laundry near the coal stove. The weight of the ornate toy pressed against his back through the straw-filled ticking, a constant reminder of his secret discovery. "You're awfully quiet today, Tommy," Margaret observed as she ladled out their evening meal. "And you took a long time at the market this morning." "Just thinking, Ma," Thomas replied, avoiding her sharp gaze. His mother had an uncanny ability to detect lies, a skill honed by years of raising children in a city full of dangers. Patrick McCarthy arrived home just as the church bells chimed 8 o'clock, his weathered hands still reeking of fish and brine. He kissed his wife's cheek and ruffled Thomas's hair before settling heavily into his chair at their small wooden table. "Another ship came in today from Ireland," Patrick said, accepting a bowl of thin stew. "The Kellys from County Cork. 3 families, 15 souls in total, all looking for work and a place to stay." "Lord have mercy," Margaret crossed herself, "as if there aren't enough of us packed into these buildings already." Thomas listened to his parents' familiar evening conversation with half an ear, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious toy hidden beneath his mattress. The nameplate had read, "William Ashford, 1860. That was nearly 40 years ago. What had happened to William? Why had his toy been abandoned in that derelict warehouse? As the family prepared for bed, Thomas's heart hammered with anticipation and dread. Mary climbed into their shared bed first, her small body curling into the worn quilt their grandmother had sent from Ireland. Thomas waited until his parents' voices faded from the next room before carefully retrieving the jack-in-the-box. In the dim light filtering through their single window, the carved figures on the sides seemed to dance and writhe. Thomas ran his fingers over the intricate woodwork, marveling at the craftsmanship. This had been an expensive toy, far beyond what any family in their tenement could afford. He turned the small brass key, and the familiar melody began to play. But this time, something was different. The painted jack-in-the-box that popped up seemed to be looking directly at him, its bright blue eyes no longer the flat paint Thomas had noticed that morning. They appeared almost alive, filled with a desperate sadness that made Thomas's chest tighten. "Who are you?" Thomas whispered, though he felt foolish talking to a toy. The melody continued, but now Thomas could hear the whispered words more clearly. "Round and round the mulberry bush, the children cannot leave. All fall down in the flames so bright none can make believe." Mary stirred beside him, mumbling in her sleep. Thomas quickly closed the lid, but the whispered singing continued for several seconds after the mechanical music stopped, as if someone else had been singing along. A chill ran down Thomas's spine as he realized the temperature in their small bedroom had dropped noticeably. His breath was beginning to mist in the air, despite the coal stove burning in the next room. He pulled the quilt up to his chin, but the cold seemed to seep through the fabric and into his bones. That's when he saw the boy. Standing in the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was a child about Thomas's own age. He wore clothes from another era, knickers, suspenders, and a white shirt with a high collar. His face was pale as moonlight, and his eyes held the same desperate sadness Thomas had seen in the jack-in-the-box. Thomas opened his mouth to cry out, but no sound emerged. The ghostly boy raised a finger to his lips in a gesture for silence, then pointed at the sleeping Mary before pointing back at himself and shaking his head sadly. "Don't wake her," the boy whispered, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "She's too little. They always take the little ones first." "Who takes them?" Thomas managed to whisper back, his voice barely audible. But the boy was already fading, becoming more translucent with each passing second. "Help us," he pleaded as he disappeared entirely. "Help us before the anniversary, before we're trapped forever." Thomas lay rigid in his bed for the remainder of the night. The jack-in-the-box clutched to his chest. The cold gradually receded, and the normal sounds of the tenement returned. Snoring from the next room, rats scurrying in the walls, the distant clatter of late-night carriages on the cobblestones below. When dawn finally crept through their window, Thomas was exhausted but resolute. The ghostly boy had asked for help, and something deep in Thomas's 8-year-old heart told him he was the only one who could provide it. But first, he needed to understand what had happened to William Ashford and why his spirit was trapped in that jack-in-the-box. Thomas had heard enough whispered conversations among the adults to know that the old warehouse district held dark secrets, stories of tragedy and death that the grown-ups preferred to forget. As his family stirred to life around him, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would find out the truth about William Ashford and the mysterious anniversary the ghost boy had mentioned. No matter what dangers lay waiting in the abandoned buildings of Lower Manhattan, the jack-in-the-box seemed to grow warmer in his hands, as if responding to his determination. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just committed himself to something far more dangerous than a simple mystery. The next morning brought no relief from Thomas's restless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he sat at the breakfast table, pushing around the thin porridge his mother had prepared. The jack-in-the-box remained hidden beneath his mattress, but he could feel its presence like a weight on his conscience. "You look like death warmed over," Margaret observed, pressing the back of her hand to Thomas's forehead. "No fever, but you're pale as a sheet. Are you feeling poorly?" "Just tired, Ma," Thomas mumbled, which was true enough. He had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep after the ghostly encounter. Patrick had already left for the docks before sunrise, and Mary was playing with her corn-husk doll in the corner, humming tunelessly to herself. The domestic normalcy felt surreal after the supernatural visitation Thomas had experienced. "I think I'll take Mary to morning mass," Margaret decided. "The fresh air will do us both good, and Father O'Malley has been asking about you. Says he hasn't seen you in confession for weeks." Thomas's head snapped up. Father O'Malley was the elderly Irish priest who had served St. Patrick's Cathedral for over 30 years. If anyone would know about the old warehouse district and its history, it would be him. The church kept records of births, deaths, and tragedies that stretched back decades. "Can I come too, Ma?" Thomas asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. Margaret looked surprised but pleased. "Of course, dear. It'll be good for your soul." An hour later, Thomas found himself kneeling in the familiar wooden pews of St. Patrick's, the scent of incense and beeswax candles filling his nostrils. The cathedral was a refuge from the crowded tenements, its vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows, offering a glimpse of beauty in their harsh world. Father O'Malley conducted the morning service in his usual mixture of English and Latin, his voice carrying easily through the stone sanctuary. Thomas tried to focus on the prayers, but his mind kept wandering to William Ashford and the desperate plea for help. After the service, as Margaret chatted with other parishioners and Mary played with the other children in the churchyard, Thomas approached the elderly priest. Father O'Malley was a small, wiry man with keen blue eyes and silver hair that seemed perpetually disheveled. "Thomas McCarthy," the priest smiled warmly. "Your mother tells me you've been having trouble sleeping. Something troubling your young mind?" Thomas glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Father, what do you know about the old warehouse district, the buildings that burned down years ago?" Father O'Malley's expression grew serious, the warmth fading from his eyes. "That's not a subject for young boys to concern themselves with, Thomas. Those are dark places with darker histories." "But I need to know," Thomas pressed. "I found something, and there was a name on it. William Ashford from 1860. The priest went very still, his weathered hands gripping his prayer book more tightly. "Where did you hear that name, boy?" Thomas's heart raced. The priest's reaction confirmed that William Ashford was more than just a name on an old toy. "I found a jack-in-the-box with his name on it, and I think I saw his ghost." Father O'Malley closed his eyes and crossed himself. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow that made Thomas's stomach clench. "Come with me," the priest said quietly. "We need to speak privately." He led Thomas through a side door into the rectory, a small building adjacent to the cathedral. The priest's study was lined with theological texts and parish records, the air thick with the smell of old paper and lamp oil. Father O'Malley closed the door and gestured for Thomas to sit in a worn leather chair. "The Ashford boy," Father O'Malley began, settling behind his desk. "I was just a young priest then, barely ordained. November 15th, 1860, the Ashford Match Factory fire." He paused, studying Thomas's face. 63 souls lost that day, most of them children no older than yourself. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Children worked in a match factory? Different times, lad. Families needed every penny they could earn, and the factory owners cared more about profits than safety. The priest's voice was heavy with old grief. The building was a death trap, wooden floors soaked with chemicals, no proper exits, windows barred to keep the workers from sneaking out. What happened? A fire started in the chemical storage room. The whole building went up in minutes. Most of the workers were trapped on the upper floors. Father O'Malley reached into his desk and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. William Ashford was 8 years old, same age as you are now. Thomas stared at the headline. Factory fire claims dozens, children among the dead. Below it was a list of victims, and there, halfway down, was William Ashford, age 8. The factory owner, Jeremiah Blackwood, claimed it was an accident, Father O'Malley continued. But there were whispers that he'd been cutting corners, storing dangerous chemicals improperly, ignoring safety concerns. The man disappeared within a week of the fire, took his money and fled to Europe. Did you perform the last rites for the victims? The priest's face darkened. That's where the real tragedy lies, Thomas. Blackwood owned the land where the factory stood. When he fled, legal ownership became unclear. The city refused to consecrate the ground properly, said it was a civil matter. Those poor souls were buried in unmarked graves in Potter's Field, never given proper Christian rites. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. So their spirits are trapped. I've heard stories over the years, Father O'Malley admitted reluctantly. Sightings in the old warehouse district, strange sounds, unexplained phenomena. Most people dismiss it as superstition, but I've always wondered. He looked directly at Thomas. You say you saw William's ghost? Thomas nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. Then God help us all, the priest whispered. November 15th is less than 2 weeks away, the anniversary of the fire. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Thomas, you must promise me you'll stay away from those buildings. Whatever you found, whatever you've seen, it's dangerous. The dead don't rest easy when they've been denied proper burial, especially not children who died in fear and pain. But even as Thomas nodded his agreement, he knew he couldn't keep that promise. William Ashford had asked for his help, and somewhere in that jack-in-the-box was a desperate spirit who had been waiting nearly 40 years for someone to hear his plea. The priest seemed to read his thoughts. I know that look, boy. You're planning something foolish. Remember this. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and ghostly children are not always what they seem. The walk home from St. Patrick's Cathedral felt longer than usual, Father O'Malley's warnings echoing in Thomas's mind with each step. Margaret chatted about the upcoming church social, while Mary skipped alongside them, seemingly oblivious to the dark revelations that had shaken Thomas to his core. But as they climbed the narrow stairs to their third-floor apartment, Thomas noticed something troubling. Mary had grown unusually quiet, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a distant, troubled expression. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone following them. That evening, as the family gathered for their meager dinner of bread and leftover stew, Mary barely touched her food. She sat hunched in her chair, occasionally shivering despite the warmth from the coal stove. "What's wrong with our little songbird tonight?" Patrick asked, reaching over to feel Mary's forehead. "You've barely said a word since we got home." "Just tired, Papa," Mary whispered, but her voice carried an odd hollow quality that made Thomas's stomach tighten with unease. After Patrick had fallen asleep in his chair by the stove, and Margaret was mending clothes by lamplight, Thomas and Mary prepared for bed. As his sister changed into her nightgown, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Across Mary's small back were what appeared to be burn marks, red welts in the shape of tiny handprints. "Mary," Thomas whispered urgently, "what happened to your back?" Mary turned to look at him, and for a moment her eyes seemed much older than her 5 years, filled with a knowledge no child should possess. "The other children did it," she said matter-of-factly. "They wanted to show me what it felt like." "What other children?" Thomas demanded, but Mary had already crawled into bed and turned away from him. Thomas lay awake for hours, the jack-in-the-box hidden beneath his pillow, listening to Mary's restless breathing beside him. Just after midnight, she began to whimper in her sleep, soft sounds of distress that gradually grew louder. "No, please," Mary mumbled, tossing her head back and forth. "It's too hot, I can't breathe. The door won't open." Thomas sat up, alarmed. Mary was drenched in sweat despite the cool night air, and her face was contorted in terror. "Mary, wake up," he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't looking at Thomas. They were staring at something beyond him, something that filled them with absolute horror. "They're all burning," Mary said in a voice that didn't sound like her own. "The little ones are crying for their mothers, but the mothers can't hear them anymore. The smoke is so thick, and the man with the keys won't let us out." "Mary, you're dreaming," Thomas said, though his own voice shook with fear. "You're safe, you're in our bed, in our apartment." But Mary continued as if she hadn't heard him. "William says you have his music box. He says you're going to help us. But the man with the keys is angry. He doesn't want us to leave. He says we belong to him now." Thomas felt the jack-in-the-box grow warm beneath his pillow, and suddenly the temperature in the room began to drop rapidly. Frost started forming on the inside of their single window, and both children's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Mary sat up abruptly, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. When she turned to face Thomas, her expression was no longer that of a frightened 5-year-old, but something ancient and desperate. "He's coming," she said in William's voice, the words emerging from Mary's throat in a tone far too deep for a little girl. "Blackwood is coming back for the anniversary. He wants to finish what he started. He wants to take more children with him." The bedroom door creaked open, though no one had touched it. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Thomas, what's wrong?" "I heard Mary crying out." At the sight of their mother, Mary blinked and seemed to return to herself, the unnatural presence leaving her small body, like air escaping from a balloon. She looked around in confusion, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama," she sobbed, reaching out her arms. "I had such terrible dreams. There was fire everywhere, and children were screaming." Margaret rushed to the bed, pulling Mary into her arms and shooting Thomas a questioning look. "It's all right, darling. Just a nightmare. You're safe now." But over Mary's head, Thomas could see that his mother's eyes were filled with a fear that matched his own. This wasn't the first time she'd heard stories of ghostly children in the old warehouse district, living in the tenements, surrounded by Irish immigrants with their own supernatural beliefs. Margaret McCarthy knew the difference between an ordinary nightmare and something far more sinister. As Margaret rocked Mary back to sleep, humming an old Irish lullaby, Thomas carefully slipped the jack-in-the-box from beneath his pillow and hid it in his shirt. He needed to get it away from Mary before it could influence her dreams again. But as he crept toward the kitchen to find a better hiding place, he could hear the faint melody beginning to play from within the wooden box, and William's whispered voice carried a new urgency. "Hurry, Thomas. He knows you have me now. Blackwood is coming back, and when he does, your sister won't be safe. None of the children will be safe. The anniversary is only 12 days away." Thomas clutched the box tighter, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his 8-year-old shoulders like a heavy cloak. Whatever was happening, whatever evil had been awakened by his discovery of the jack-in-the-box, it was escalating quickly, and now his little sister was caught in the middle of it. From the bedroom came the sound of Mary's voice, soft and sleepy. "Tommy, why are there children standing in our room?" Thomas's blood turned to ice as he realized that bringing the jack-in-the-box into their home hadn't just connected him to William Ashford's spirit. It had opened a doorway, and more of the factory fire's victims were beginning to cross over. The question was, were they coming to help, or were they part of something much more dangerous? Thomas stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the jack-in-the-box trembling in his hands as Mary's innocent question hung in the air like a death knell. From the bedroom came the soft sound of Margaret's lullaby faltering, then stopping entirely. "What children, sweetheart?" Margaret's voice was carefully controlled, but Thomas could hear the underlying terror. "The ones in the old clothes," Mary replied sleepily. "There's a girl with braids and a boy with no shoes and another boy who's all burned up. They're just standing there, watching us." Thomas crept back toward the bedroom, peering around the doorframe. In the dim light filtering through their frost-covered window, he could see his mother sitting on the edge of the bed, Mary curled in her lap. But Margaret's face was turned toward the far corner of the room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and protective fury. Following her gaze, Thomas felt his heart stop. There, partially visible in the shadows, stood 3 ghostly children. They were translucent, like figures made of moonlight and memory, but their details were heartbreakingly clear. The girl couldn't have been more than 6, her hair in neat braids that had once been blonde, but now appeared grey as ash. The barefoot boy was perhaps 7, his clothes patched and worn even in death, and the third child. Thomas had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. The burned boy was barely recognizable as human, his clothes and flesh charred beyond recognition, yet somehow Thomas knew this was William Ashford. The ghost turned toward him, and when their eyes met, Thomas felt a jolt of connection that made the jack-in-the-box grow warm in his hands. "She can see us now," William's voice whispered directly into Thomas's mind. "Your sister is sensitive like you, but that makes her dangerous to him." "Who is him?" Thomas thought back, hoping the ghost could hear him. "The man who killed us, Jeremiah Blackwood. He made a deal with something dark on the night of the fire, traded our souls for his own escape. But the debt comes due on the anniversary, and he needs fresh spirits to pay it." Margaret suddenly stood up, still holding Mary, and began backing toward the bedroom door. "Thomas," she said quietly, "come here slowly. Don't make any sudden movements." But as Thomas stepped into the room, more figures began to materialize. They emerged from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Children of all ages, their clothes spanning different decades, all bearing the marks of violent death. Some showed signs of burns, others appeared to have been crushed or suffocated. Their eyes held a desperate hunger that made Thomas's skin crawl. 63 souls, William's voice continued in Thomas's head. Blackwood has been collecting us for almost 40 years, taking children who won't be missed. Street orphans, immigrant children, the forgotten ones. Every few years, when the barrier grows thin, he returns to gather more. Mary began to whimper, pressing her face against Margaret's shoulder. "Mama, they're getting closer. They want something from Tommy." The ghostly children had indeed begun to move, drifting across the small room with an unnatural gliding motion, but Thomas noticed that they weren't all moving together. The burned victims from the original factory fire, including William, remained where they were, while a separate group of spirits with more recent injuries began to circle the family. "Don't trust all of them," William warned urgently. "Some are Blackwood's servants now. He corrupted them, made them his hunters. They seek out sensitive children like you and your sister." Thomas clutched the jack-in-the-box tighter and felt a sudden surge of protective anger. These weren't just random ghosts haunting their home. They were part of something deliberate, something evil that was specifically targeting his family. "What do you want?" Thomas called out to the approaching spirits, his voice stronger than he felt. One of the corrupted children, a boy who appeared to have died in the 1880s based on his clothing, smiled with too many teeth. "We want you to come with us," he said in a voice like breaking glass. "Master Blackwood has such wonderful games to play, and your little sister would make a perfect addition to our family." Margaret let out a sharp gasp and backed against the wall, Mary still in her arms. "Thomas, whatever's happening, we need to get out of here, now." But as she spoke, the bedroom door slammed shut with tremendous force. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and ice began forming on every surface. The corrupted spirits moved closer, their forms becoming more solid and menacing. Thomas looked desperately at William's ghost. "What do I do?" "Open the box," William replied. "Let my song play. It will remind the others who they really are, before Blackwood's corruption took hold." With shaking hands, Thomas turned the brass key. The familiar melody began to play, but this time it was different. Instead of the haunting, whispered words about children falling down, Thomas heard a pure, sweet lullaby that seemed to cut through the supernatural cold like a warm blade. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The corrupted spirits recoiled as if the music physically hurt them, their forms becoming less solid. Several of them began to flicker between their corrupted appearances and what they must have looked like when they first died. Innocent children stolen from life too soon. "Remember," William's voice rose above the melody, speaking to the other ghosts. "Remember who you were before he took you. Remember your families, your dreams, your humanity." One by one, the corrupted spirits began to change. The boy from the 1880s blinked in confusion, his predatory smile fading to reveal the frightened child he had once been. A girl who had appeared as a decaying corpse transformed back into a 7-year-old with ringlet curls and a torn blue dress. But the music also had an unexpected effect. From somewhere else in the building, Thomas could hear other sounds. Footsteps in empty apartments, doors creaking open, the distant sound of children crying. The jack-in-the-box wasn't just affecting the spirits in their bedroom. It was calling to every trapped soul in the entire tenement district. "Oh no," William whispered, his ghostly face filled with new terror. "Too many at once. We're not ready. He'll sense the disturbance and come for us tonight." As if summoned by William's words, a new presence began to fill the room. This wasn't the lost spirit of a child, but something adult and malevolent. The air grew thick and oppressive, and shadows began to writhe and twist in the corners like living things. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, clutching Mary tightly. "Thomas, stop the music. Whatever you're doing, stop it now." But Thomas found he couldn't move his hands to close the lid. The jack-in-the-box seemed to have taken on a will of its own, the melody growing louder and more insistent. Through their frost-covered window, he could see lights flickering on throughout the tenement buildings as families woke to supernatural disturbances in their own homes. "He's coming," William said, his voice filled with 40 years of accumulated terror. "Jeremiah Blackwood is coming, and we've just told him exactly where to find you. Mad, the bedroom window exploded inward in a shower of glass and freezing air, and through the opening came something that had once been human, but was now much, much worse. The thing that came through the window was a nightmare made manifest. It had the general shape of a man, but its edges seemed to blur and shift like smoke given malevolent purpose. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness punctuated by two burning coals that served as eyes. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of flames consuming wood and flesh. "My children," it hissed, the words seeming to come from everywhere at once. "How I've missed you," Margaret screamed and pressed herself harder against the wall, shielding Mary with her body. The corrupted spirits that had been slowly returning to their innocent forms immediately snapped back to their twisted appearances, falling to their knees before the shadow creature. "Master Blackwood," they whispered in unison, their voices like breaking glass, "we have found them for you." Thomas stood frozen, the jack-in-the-box still playing its haunting melody in his trembling hands. William's ghost moved to stand between Thomas and the shadow man, his burned form somehow managing to look protective despite his own terrifying appearance. "You cannot have them," William declared, his voice stronger than Thomas had ever heard it. "These children are under my protection." The shadow that had once been Jeremiah Blackwood laughed, a sound like logs collapsing in a fire. "Your protection? You forget yourself, William. You belong to me now, as do all the others. 40 years I've waited for this anniversary, gathering strength, collecting souls, and now with these two sensitive children, I'll have enough power to break free of the earthly bonds that have trapped me here." Thomas found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want with us?" The burning coal eyes fixed on him, and Thomas felt as though he were being examined by something infinitely old and evil. "Want? Child, you misunderstand. This isn't about want. This is about necessity. Every soul I've claimed has been building toward this moment. The barrier between worlds grows thin on the anniversary of great tragedies, and tomorrow marks exactly 38 years since the fire. 2 more years, and my debt comes due." "What debt?" Thomas managed to ask, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "The debt I owe to the forces that saved me from the flames." Blackwood's shadow form writhed as he spoke. "I made a bargain that night as my factory burned, my life in exchange for service. 40 years of collecting innocent souls, feeding them to the darkness that dwells between worlds. But the contract stipulates that if I fail to deliver sufficient payment by the 40th anniversary, my own soul will be claimed instead." William's ghost turned to Thomas, his expression desperate. "That's why he needs you and Mary. Your sensitivity to the spirit world makes your souls worth dozens of ordinary ones. With you he'll have enough to satisfy his dark masters and earn his freedom." Mary began to cry softly, her small voice cutting through the supernatural tension. "Tommy, I'm scared. The burned man is scary, but the shadow man is worse." Margaret found her voice then, her maternal instincts overriding her terror. "You stay away from my children, whatever you are. I don't care if you're the devil himself, you won't touch them." Blackwood's attention shifted to her, and Thomas saw something that might have been amusement flicker in those coal-bright eyes. Brave words from a woman whose husband works the docks for pennies a day. "Tell me, Mrs. McCarthy, what would you do to ensure your family's prosperity? What price would you pay to lift them out of this squalor?" Margaret's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Nothing that would cost us our souls." "Admirable," Blackwood mused. "But perhaps you'll reconsider when you see what I can offer." The shadow man gestured, and suddenly the small, cramped apartment began to change. The walls expanded outward, the ceiling rose to grand heights, and rich furnishings materialized from nothing. The cold, drafty space became warm and luxurious, filled with the kind of comfort the McCarthy family had never known. "This could all be yours," Blackwood continued. "Wealth, comfort, position in society. All I ask in return is what I'm going to take anyway. Let me have the children willingly, and I'll ensure your surviving family never wants for anything again." Thomas saw his mother waver for just a moment, her eyes taking in the impossible luxury surrounding them. He understood the temptation. They lived in grinding poverty, always one missed day of work away from eviction, always hungry, always cold. What parent wouldn't be tempted by such an offer? But then Margaret's jaw set with determination. "No, my children are not for sale at any price." The illusion shattered immediately, returning them to their shabby reality. Blackwood's form seemed to grow larger and more menacing. "Then you force me to take them by less pleasant means." The corrupted spirits began to move toward Thomas and Mary, their eyes now glowing with the same malevolent light as their masters. But William and the other factory fire victims moved to block them, creating a barrier of ghostly children between Blackwood's servants and the living family. "You forget," William called out to the corrupted spirits. "The music box has reminded you who you really are. You don't have to serve him anymore. You can choose to fight." Thomas saw several of the corrupted children hesitate, confusion flickering across their features. The melody from the jack-in-the-box seemed to be growing stronger, and with it came whispered memories of lives cut short, of families mourned, of innocence stolen. One of the corrupted spirits, the girl with ringlet curls, suddenly broke free from Blackwood's influence entirely. "I remember," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I remember my mother's lullabies. I remember being loved. And I remember being murdered," added the boy from the 1880s, his predatory expression replaced by righteous anger. "You promised me peace, but you gave me only hunger and hatred." One by one, more of the corrupted spirits began to turn against their master. Blackwood's shadow form flickered with rage, becoming less solid as his control over his servants weakened. "Foolish children," he snarled. "You think you can defy me. I am your creator, your master, your God." But Thomas noticed something important. As the corrupted spirits broke free from Blackwood's influence, the Shadow Man became less substantial, more vulnerable. His power seemed to be directly tied to the number of souls under his control. "William," Thomas called out, "how many spirits does he have left? How many more children has he taken over the years?" William's burned face showed a grim understanding. "Too many, Thomas. Even with these few breaking free, he still commands dozens of corrupted souls scattered throughout the city. And if he claims you and Mary tonight, it will be enough to complete his contract." Blackwood seemed to read the direction of Thomas's thoughts. "Clever boy. Yes, I need only 2 more souls of sufficient power, and you've made this so much easier by calling attention to yourselves." The Shadow Man began to advance, his form becoming more solid and menacing with each step. The freed spirits formed a protective circle around the McCarthy family, but Thomas could see they were vastly outnumbered by the corrupted children still under Blackwood's control. As the supernatural battle was about to begin in earnest, Thomas heard something that filled him with both hope and terror. Heavy footsteps pounding up the tenement stairs, accompanied by his father's voice shouting their names. Patrick McCarthy was coming home early from his night shift, drawn by the supernatural disturbance that was affecting the entire building, but Thomas realized with growing horror that his father was walking straight into a trap that could claim not just him and Mary, but their entire family. The sound of Patrick's heavy work boots on the wooden stairs grew louder with each passing second. Thomas could hear his father calling out as he climbed, his voice filled with concern and confusion. "Margaret, what in God's name is happening up there? The whole building's gone mad. Mrs. Kowalski says there are children crying in the walls, and old Chen swears she saw her dead grandson in her kitchen." Blackwood's shadow form seemed to pulse with anticipation. How thoughtful of him to join us. A father's soul, sacrificed trying to protect his children, carries particular power. "This grows more promising by the moment." "No," Thomas said, finding strength he didn't know he possessed. "You won't hurt my father. You won't hurt any of my family." The jack-in-the-box in his hands suddenly grew blazing hot, not enough to burn, but warm enough to be startling. The melody it played began to change, becoming less of a simple children's song and more of something ancient and powerful. William's ghost looked at Thomas with something approaching hope. "The music box was blessed," William said, his voice filled with sudden understanding. "Father O'Malley, he must have consecrated it years ago after the fire. That's why it survived all these decades, why it called to you. It's not just my prison, Thomas. It's a weapon." Margaret, still clutching Mary, looked toward the door with desperate love and terror. "Patrick, don't come up here. Stay downstairs. Get help." But it was too late. The apartment door burst open, and Patrick McCarthy stood in the doorway, his weathered face illuminated by the supernatural cold fire that now filled the room. His eyes went wide as he took in the impossible scene. His family huddled against the wall, ghostly children filling the space, and a creature of living shadow dominating the center of the room. To his credit, Patrick didn't flee. Instead, he stepped into the room and slammed the door behind him, positioning himself between his family and the supernatural threat. "I don't know what you are," he said to Blackwood, his voice steady, despite the fear Thomas could see in his eyes, "but you'll not be harming my children." Blackwood laughed, the sound like timber collapsing in a furnace. Another brave parent. How refreshing, but bravery without power is merely foolishness. The shadow man gestured, and Patrick suddenly doubled over as if struck by an invisible fist. He gasped for breath, frost forming around his mouth as the supernatural cold attacked his lungs. "Papa!" Mary cried out, struggling in Margaret's arms. Thomas felt rage build in his chest, a pure, protective fury that seemed to resonate with the jack-in-the-box. The melody grew even stronger, and now he could hear other voices joining William's song. Not just the spirits in their apartment, but ghostly children throughout the building, throughout the entire district. The blessed music was calling to every trapped soul, offering them a choice between corruption and redemption. "William," Thomas called out, "what do I need to do? How do we stop him?" William's burned form flickered, becoming more solid as the music strengthened him. "The blessing on the box can cleanse corrupted spirits, but it can't destroy Blackwood directly. He's too powerful, too deeply rooted in darkness. But there's another way." "Tell me." "The contract he signed, every supernatural bargain has terms, conditions that must be met exactly. If we can make him violate those terms..." One of the freed spirits, the girl with ringlet curls, suddenly spoke up. "The children must be taken willingly. That's part of his binding. He can frighten us, threaten us, hurt our families, but the final claiming must be our choice." Thomas looked at his family, his father struggling to breathe, his mother terrified but defiant, his little sister crying but not breaking. They were all in danger because of him, because he had found the jack-in-the-box and brought this evil into their home. "Then I choose," Thomas declared, his voice carrying clearly over the supernatural chaos. "I'll go with you willingly, Blackwood, but you have to let my family go. All of them. Forever." "Thomas, no!" Margaret screamed. "Son, don't you dare!" Patrick gasped, struggling to stand upright. But Blackwood's coal-bright eyes fixed on Thomas with obvious satisfaction. "A noble sacrifice. Very well, boy. Come to me willingly, and your family will never be harmed by my hand." Thomas started to step forward, but William's ghost suddenly grabbed his arm. The touch was cold, but somehow comforting. "Wait," the spirit whispered urgently. "Listen to his exact words. Never be harmed by my hand. What about his servants? What about other supernatural threats? He's trying to trick you." Thomas stopped, his mind racing. Blackwood was indeed trying to manipulate him with a false bargain, one that would save his family from Blackwood himself, but leave them vulnerable to countless other dangers. "That's not good enough," Thomas said, surprising himself with his boldness. "If you want me to come willingly, you have to swear by whatever dark powers you serve that my entire family will be protected from all supernatural harm for the rest of their natural lives." Blackwood's shadow form flickered with irritation. "Clever child. But you ask for more than I can promise. I serve powers that do not make exceptions for sentiment." "Then you don't get my willing cooperation," Thomas replied, "and according to your own contract, you can't take me by force." The shadow man's rage was palpable, causing the temperature in the room to plummet even further. Ice began forming on the walls, and the ghostly children around them flickered like candle flames in a strong wind. "There are other ways," Blackwood snarled. "Your sister, for instance. So young, so sensitive to our world. Perhaps if she were to suffer enough, she might choose to escape her pain by joining us." As he spoke, Mary suddenly stiffened in Margaret's arms. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and she began to convulse as if in tremendous pain. "What are you doing to her?" Thomas shouted. "Showing her what it feels like to burn alive," Blackwood replied coldly. "The same pain little William felt in 1860. She can make it stop by simply agreeing to come with me." Mary's small body arched in agony, and Thomas could see actual burn marks beginning to appear on her arms. The sight of his innocent sister suffering filled him with a protective rage so pure and powerful that the jack-in-the-box in his hands suddenly blazed with white light. "You want willing souls?" Thomas roared, his voice echoing with supernatural power. "Then here's my choice. I choose to fight you. I choose to stand with William and all the other children you've murdered. And I choose to send you back to whatever hell spawned you." The blessed music box erupted with brilliant light, and every freed spirit in the room suddenly became solid and strong. William stepped forward, no longer appearing as a burned victim, but as the 8-year-old boy he had been in life, whole and determined. "We choose to fight too," William declared, speaking for all the liberated spirits, "and we choose to protect this family that showed us courage." The supernatural battle was about to begin in earnest, with the fate of not just the McCarthy family, but every trapped soul in New York hanging in the balance. The brilliant white light emanating from the jack-in-the-box transformed the cramped tenement apartment into a supernatural battlefield. The freed spirits, empowered by Thomas's defiant choice and the blessed music, stood with renewed strength against Blackwood's corrupted servants. William, now appearing as he had in life, led the charge. "For every child stolen, for every family destroyed, for every year of suffering," he cried out, his voice ringing with righteous fury. The corrupted spirits that remained loyal to Blackwood rushed forward, their forms twisted by decades of malevolent service, but they met fierce resistance from the liberated souls, who fought with the desperate strength of those who finally had hope for redemption. Blackwood himself recoiled from the blessed light, his shadow form becoming unstable and flickering. "This changes nothing," he roared, though Thomas could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I still command dozens of souls throughout the city. Even if you destroy these few, I will have my payment." Patrick, released from the supernatural cold that had been choking him, struggled to his feet and moved to shield his family. "I don't understand what's happening," he said to Thomas, "but I know my son when I see him making a stand. Whatever you need to do, boy, do it." Margaret held Mary close, the burn marks on the little girl's arms beginning to fade as Blackwood's attention was diverted to the spiritual battle raging around them. "Thomas," his mother called out, "that music box. There's something special about it, isn't there?" Thomas nodded, understanding flooding through him as he watched the blessed light push back the supernatural darkness. Father O'Malley must have consecrated it after the fire. It's been waiting all these years for someone to use it properly. One of the freed spirits, the barefoot boy Thomas had first seen, suddenly called out in warning. "More are coming. He's summoning his servants from across the city." Through the broken window, Thomas could see dark shapes moving across the rooftops of the tenement buildings. Corrupted spirits were converging on their location, drawn by Blackwood's call for reinforcement. The Shadow Man's form began to solidify again as his scattered servants approached. "You see?" Blackwood laughed, his confidence returning. "Even blessed objects have limits. When my full army arrives, your little rebellion will be crushed, and I'll take not just you and your sister, but your parents as well, for the inconvenience you've caused me." But William turned to Thomas with sudden inspiration. "The music isn't just reaching the spirits in this building. It's calling to every trapped soul in the city. Some of them are his servants, yes, but others are victims like us, waiting for someone to offer them a choice." Thomas understood immediately. The music box isn't just a weapon. It's a beacon. It's giving every corrupted spirit a chance to remember who they really were. As the dark shapes approached their building, Thomas made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He opened the jack-in-the-box wider, allowing the blessed melody to pour out with even greater intensity. The white light grew so bright it hurt to look at directly, and the music became so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. As Blackwood's corrupted servants reached the tenement, many of them suddenly stopped mid-flight. The blessed music was breaking through decades of spiritual corruption, reminding them of their stolen childhoods, their lost innocence, their murdered humanity. One by one, the approaching spirits began to change. A girl who had appeared as a vengeful wraith remembered being 6 years old and loving her mother's bedtime stories. A boy whose form had been twisted into something monstrous recalled playing with wooden toys and dreaming of becoming a sailor. "No!" Blackwood screamed, his shadow form beginning to fragment as more of his servants broke free from his control. "You belong to me. I made you what you are." "You made us into monsters," one of the newly freed spirits replied, her voice clear and strong. "But we choose to remember what we were before. We choose to be children again." The spiritual battle reached a crescendo as dozens of liberated souls surrounded Blackwood, their combined will and the power of the blessed music box, creating a prison of light around the Shadow Man. He thrashed against their containment, his form becoming increasingly unstable. But Thomas noticed something troubling. The jack-in-the-box was growing incredibly hot in his hands, and hairline cracks were beginning to appear in its wooden surface. The blessing that had protected it for nearly 40 years was being consumed by the massive spiritual energy it was channeling. "William!" Thomas called out urgently. "The music box is breaking apart. How much longer can it hold?" William's spirit looked at the fracturing artifact with growing alarm. "Not long enough. Even with all these spirits freed, Blackwood himself is too powerful. The box will destroy itself before it can banish him permanently." Margaret, who had been listening to their exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Thomas, what if it's not meant to banish him? What if it's meant to do something else?" "What do you mean, Ma? You said the priest consecrated it after the fire." What if Father O'Malley intended it to provide proper last rites for the children who died? What if the music box can finally lay all these spirits to rest? The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The jack-in-the-box wasn't a weapon at all. It was a key, a means of completing the sacred ritual that had been denied to the factory fire victims for nearly 40 years. If he could somehow use it to perform the last rites, to properly consecrate their deaths, it would free not just William and the other children, but break the supernatural contract that bound them all to Blackwood. "But I don't know how to perform last rites," Thomas protested. "I'm just a child." "Faith doesn't require training," Patrick said unexpectedly, his practical dock worker's wisdom cutting through the supernatural complexity. "If the priest blessed that thing to help these children find peace, then your belief is all that matters." Thomas looked around at the dozens of ghostly children now surrounding them, all waiting with desperate hope for someone to finally acknowledge their stolen lives and grant them the peaceful rest they had been denied. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the love he felt for these innocent victims and his own family. The jack-in-the-box gave another alarming crack, and more of Blackwood's shadow form began seeping through the prison of light. Time was running out, and Thomas had to make a choice that would determine the fate of every soul in the room. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "William, tell me what I need to say." William's spirit moved closer to Thomas, his form flickering between the burned victim he had become and the innocent child he had been. Around them, the prison of light holding Blackwood was beginning to weaken as more cracks appeared in the jack-in-the-box. "The words don't matter as much as the intention," William said urgently. "Father O'Malley used to say that God hears the heart, not just the voice. You need to acknowledge our deaths, forgive our killers, and release us to whatever comes next." Thomas nodded, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the fracturing music box. He looked around at the dozens of ghostly children who had gathered in their small apartment, their translucent faces filled with desperate hope. "I don't know the proper prayers," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I know you were all innocent. I know you deserved better than what happened to you." The blessed light from the jack-in-the-box pulsed brighter, and several of the spirits nodded encouragingly. "You were children," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "How you had families who loved you, dreams for your futures, games you wanted to play. Your lives mattered. Your deaths were a terrible injustice, and for 40 years, no one has properly mourned you or honored your memory." Blackwood's shadow form writhed against his spiritual prison, his coal-bright eyes fixed on Thomas with murderous hatred. "You cannot break what was forged in darkness, boy. These souls are mine by right of contract." But Thomas ignored him, focusing entirely on the ghostly children. "I may not be a priest, but I have faith. I believe in a God who loves children, who protects the innocent, who offers peace to those who have suffered. In his name I acknowledge your deaths and your pain." The jack-in-the-box grew so hot that Thomas's palms began to blister, but he held on tightly. The melody was changing again, becoming something ancient and sacred, a hymn that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. "William Ashford," Thomas said, looking directly at the spirit who had started this journey. "You were 8 years old when you died in the factory fire on November 15th, 1860. You loved music boxes and probably missed your mother terribly when she sent you to work. I'm sorry no one was there to help you when the flames came. I'm sorry you've been trapped for so long." William's ghostly form began to shimmer, becoming more translucent but somehow more peaceful. "Thank you," he whispered, tears streaming down his spectral cheeks. "I can feel it working. I can feel the chains breaking." Thomas turned to the girl with ringlet curls. "I don't know your name, but I know you were someone's daughter. Someone who braided your hair in the morning and kissed you goodnight. You deserve to grow up, to have a family of your own, to live a full life. I'm sorry that was taken from you." One by one, Thomas addressed as many of the spirits as he could, acknowledging their stolen lives and their individual worth. With each recognition, the ghostly children became more peaceful, their forms beginning to fade not into darkness, but into a gentle, warm light. Margaret and Patrick stood watching in awe as their 8-year-old son performed what could only be described as a miracle. Mary had stopped crying and was staring at the spectacle with the wide-eyed wonder that only children possess. "But it's not enough," William said, though his voice was growing fainter as the sacred ritual continued. "Blackwood's contract isn't just about the children he claimed, it's about the injustice itself. Someone has to forgive him, or the darkness will find another way to corrupt these souls." Thomas felt his heart sink. How could he possibly forgive the monster who had murdered dozens of innocent children, who had threatened his family, who had caused nearly 4 decades of suffering. "I can't," Thomas said honestly. "I can't forgive him for what he's done." "Then I will," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Father O'Malley standing in the apartment entrance, his usually disheveled silver hair now perfectly arranged, his eyes shining with divine purpose. But as he stepped into the room, Thomas realized this wasn't quite the elderly priest he knew. This was Father O'Malley as he had been in 1860, a young man filled with passionate faith and righteous anger. "Father?" Thomas whispered, confused. "I've been waiting for this moment for 38 years, the spectral priest said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of prayer and sacrifice. "I was the one who blessed that music box, the one who begged God for a chance to provide proper last rites for these children. I've been bound to this place as surely as they have, waiting for someone with enough faith to complete the ritual." The ghostly Father O'Malley approached Blackwood's struggling shadow form, his presence causing the corrupted spirits, still loyal to the industrialist, to recoil in terror. "Jeremiah Blackwood," the priest said formally, "you stand accused before God and these innocent souls of murder, corruption, and the damning of children's spirits. Do you confess your sins?" "I confess nothing," Blackwood snarled. "I did what was necessary to survive. The factory was failing. The insurance money was my only hope." "So you set the fire deliberately," Father O'Malley said, not seeming surprised. "You murdered 63 souls for money, then compounded your sin by binding their spirits to your service." "They would have died anyway," Blackwood protested. "Poor children. Immigrant children, unwanted children. I gave their deaths meaning." The jack-in-the-box in Thomas's hands suddenly blazed with such intense light that everyone in the room had to shield their eyes. When the radiance faded slightly, Father O'Malley was holding a matching music box, its melody harmonizing perfectly with the one in Thomas's possession. "No," the priest said gently, "you gave their deaths only pain. But I give them forgiveness, and through God's grace I release both you and these children from the bonds of earthly suffering." The combined melodies of the 2 music boxes created a sound so beautiful and pure that Thomas felt tears streaming down his face. One by one the ghostly children began to ascend, their forms dissolving into points of warm, golden light that drifted upward through the ceiling and beyond. "Thank you," William whispered as his spirit began to fade. "For everything. Take care of your family, Thomas. They're precious beyond measure." Even Blackwood's shadow form was beginning to change, the corrupting darkness falling away to reveal the frightened, desperate man he had been underneath. "I'm sorry," he whispered as his own spirit began to ascend. "I was so afraid of dying. I was so afraid of being poor again. I'm sorry for what I became." Father O'Malley nodded with infinite compassion. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I absolve you of your sins. Go in peace, and may God have mercy on your soul." The last of the spirits faded into golden light, leaving the McCarthy family alone in their small apartment. The jack-in-the-box in Thomas's hands crumbled to dust, its sacred purpose finally fulfilled. In the sudden silence, Mary's small voice piped up, "Tommy, the burned children are all better now. They're not scared anymore." Thomas smiled through his tears, exhaustion finally overtaking him as the supernatural energy drained from the room. "Yes, Mary, they're all better now." Dawn crept through the shattered window of the McCarthy apartment, casting pale autumn light across a scene that looked as though a terrible storm had passed through. Frost still clung to the walls despite the mild October weather, and the wooden floor was littered with the remnants of the jack-in-the-box, now nothing more than splinters and dust. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands where the blessed music box had burned him. The blisters were already beginning to heal, leaving behind faint scars that would serve as a permanent reminder of the night's supernatural events. Beside him, Mary slept peacefully for the first time in days, her small face relaxed and free from the nightmares that had plagued her. Margaret moved quietly around the apartment, sweeping up broken glass and trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to their home. She worked with the efficient calm of a woman who had survived too much hardship to be permanently shaken by even supernatural threats. But Thomas noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she handled the larger shards. Patrick sat at their small table, a cup of weak coffee growing cold in front of him, as he stared out through the broken window at the warehouse district beyond. The hard-working dock laborer had always been a practical man, more concerned with putting food on the table than pondering mysteries beyond his understanding, but the events of the previous night had shaken his world-view to its foundations. "Da," Thomas said quietly, not wanting to wake Mary. Patrick turned to look at his son, and Thomas was surprised to see not fear or confusion in his father's eyes, but something approaching pride. "Aye, boy? Do you think anyone will believe what happened here?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Does it matter?" he finally asked. "Those children are at peace now because of what you did. That's what counts, not whether the neighbors think we've gone mad." Margaret paused in her sweeping to look at Thomas. "You saved them, didn't you? All those poor souls who'd been trapped for so long." Thomas nodded, though the weight of what he'd experienced still felt enormous on his 8-year-old shoulders. "I think so, but I couldn't have done it alone. William helped me understand what needed to be done, and Father O'Malley—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "What about Father O'Malley?" Margaret asked gently. "He was there, but not the way he is now. He was young like he would have been when the fire happened. Do you think he was really there, or did I imagine it?" Before either parent could answer, a knock came at their door. Margaret and Patrick exchanged glances, neither eager to explain their broken window and frost-covered walls to whoever might be visiting so early in the morning. Patrick opened the door to reveal Father O'Malley himself, though this was clearly the elderly priest Thomas knew from church, not the youthful spirit who had helped perform the last rites. The old man's eyes were bright with understanding and compassion as he took in the state of their apartment. "I thought I might find you in need of comfort this morning," the priest said softly. "The whole district felt the spiritual disturbance last night. I've been visiting families who experienced unusual events." "Father," Thomas began, unsure how to explain what had happened, but the priest raised a gentle hand to stop him. "I know, my boy. I've always known this day would come, though I wasn't certain I'd live to see it." He stepped into the apartment and closed the door behind him. "May I see the remnants of the music box?" Thomas led him to where the wooden fragments lay scattered across the floor. Father O'Malley knelt down and picked up a small piece that still bore traces of the gilt decorations, holding it reverently in his weathered hands. "I blessed this when I was barely older than your father is now," the priest said quietly. "After the fire, when I realized those poor children would never receive proper last rites, I prayed for a way to help them find peace. God provided this answer, though it took nearly 40 years to unfold." "Were you really there last night?" Thomas asked. "I mean the young version of you?" Father O'Malley smiled sadly. "In a way, yes. When we make sacred promises, especially in times of great tragedy, part of our soul becomes bound to that purpose until it's fulfilled. Last night you completed the work I began decades ago." Margaret approached the priest, her voice hesitant. "Father, what about the building where the fire happened? The warehouse where Thomas found the music box?" "Gone," the priest replied simply. "When the spirits were finally laid to rest, the corruption that had been festering there was cleansed as well. By the time the sun rises fully, there will be nothing left but empty land ready for something new and hopeful to be built." As if to confirm his words, a strange rumbling sound came from the direction of the warehouse district. Thomas rushed to the broken window and looked out to see the abandoned buildings collapsing one by one, not in violent destruction, but in a gentle settling, as if they were simply tired and ready to rest. "The land will be blessed now," Father O'Malley continued. "Whatever is built there will bring life and joy instead of suffering and death." Mary stirred in the bed, opening her eyes and looking around the room with the clear, innocent gaze of a child who had slept without nightmares. When she saw Father O'Malley, she smiled brightly. "Hello, Father," she said, sitting up. "The burned children aren't sad anymore. They said to tell you thank you." The elderly priest's eyes filled with tears. "Did they now? Well, you tell them they're very welcome, and that they should rest easy knowing they're finally home." Mary nodded solemnly, as if this were a perfectly normal conversation to be having over breakfast. Patrick cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Father, what do we tell people about last night? About the window, the sounds, the—" He gestured helplessly at the frost still clinging to their walls. "Tell them the truth," Father O'Malley replied, "that your family helped some lost souls find their way home. Whether people choose to believe it or dismiss it as fancy is up to them, but you'll know what really happened, and that's what matters." Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized was there. The supernatural crisis was truly over. The trapped spirits were at peace and his family was safe. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe freely. "Will we see them again?" Thomas asked. "William and the others?" Father O'Malley smiled warmly. "Perhaps someday in a better place. But for now they're where they belong, and so are you. You have a life to live, Thomas McCarthy, and after what you've accomplished, I suspect it's going to be quite an extraordinary one." As the morning light grew stronger, Washing away the last shadows of the supernatural night, the McCarthy family began the process of healing and moving forward, forever changed by their encounter with the spirits of the past, but ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the supernatural battle, and life in the McCarthy household had settled into a new rhythm. The broken window had been repaired, the frost damage painted over, and the scars on Thomas's hands had faded to thin white lines that only he and his family could see. But other changes were more profound and mysterious. Patrick had arrived home from the docks that morning with news that had the entire family gathered around their small kitchen table in stunned silence. "The foreman pulled me aside after we finished unloading the morning ship," Patrick said, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once. "Said there's been an inquiry about me. Some businessman from uptown looking to hire experienced dock workers for a new shipping company he's starting." Margaret looked up from the mending in her lap, her needle suspended in mid-stitch. "What kind of businessman?" "Name's Harrison. English fellow, apparently. Owns warehouses all along the East River. Looking to expand his operations. The pay he's offering," Patrick shook his head in disbelief, "3 times what I'm making now, plus steady hours and Sundays off." Thomas felt a flutter of something that might have been supernatural awareness. "Where are these warehouses, Da?" "That's the strangest part," Patrick replied, looking directly at his son. "They're being built on the land where those old buildings used to stand. The ones that collapsed the night after." He trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Father O'Malley had been right. The cleansed land was already bringing new opportunities, new hope to the families who had struggled in its shadow for so long. Mary, who had been playing quietly with her corn-husk doll, suddenly looked up with the preternaturally wise expression that had become familiar since her encounter with the spirits. "The lady with the pretty dress told me about Mr. Harrison," she said matter-of-factly. "She said he's a good man who lost his own little boy to sickness, and now he wants to help other children's fathers find good work." Margaret and Patrick exchanged glances. They had learned not to question Mary's occasional conversations with people only she could see, especially since these encounters always seemed to bring helpful information or comfort. "What lady, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. "The one who used to work in the big house on 5th Avenue. She has golden hair and speaks with a funny accent. She says she's watching over us now because Thomas helped her little brother find peace." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He had a feeling he knew who Mary was describing, though he'd never mentioned the well-dressed spirit he'd glimpsed among the factory fire victims during the supernatural battle. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret rose to answer it, revealing Mrs. Kowalski from next door, her face flushed with excitement. "Margaret, you'll never believe what's happened," the Polish woman said, barely containing her enthusiasm. "My Anton got a letter today. A scholarship to study engineering at Columbia College. They say some anonymous benefactor is paying for immigrant children to get proper education. More changes, more opportunities arising from the cleansed land and the peaceful rest of the trapped spirits." Thomas was beginning to understand that helping William and the others had set in motion ripples of positive change that would touch many lives beyond his own family. Over the following days, similar stories began spreading throughout the neighborhood. Children who had been working in dangerous factories were mysteriously offered places in new schools. Families facing eviction found their rent mysteriously paid. Sick relatives began recovering from illnesses that had lingered for months. The Irish, Italian, Polish, and Chinese immigrants who crowded the Lower East Side tenements started calling it the blessing, though none of them could explain exactly where it was coming from. Thomas knew, but he kept the knowledge to himself, sharing it only with Mary during their quiet conversations before sleep. The spirits they had helped find peace were using whatever influence they had in the afterlife to improve conditions for the living, especially for children and families who reminded them of their own truncated lives. One evening, as the family sat around their table sharing the first truly abundant meal they'd had in months, thanks to Patrick's new position with Harrison Shipping, Margaret asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Thomas, do you think what happened to us will happen again? Will there be other spirits needing help?" Thomas considered the question seriously. The faint scars on his hands seemed to tingle slightly, as if responding to some supernatural awareness he hadn't fully lost. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But if there are, I think we'll know what to do. We'll listen, and we'll try to help, just like we did for William and the others." Patrick nodded approvingly. "That's what families do, son. We help those in need, whether they're living or—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Otherwise." Mary giggled at her father's diplomatic phrasing, and the sound filled their small apartment with warmth and joy that had been absent for far too long. As winter approached and 1898 drew to a close, the McCarthy family had found not just survival, but prosperity in their new circumstances. Thomas attended school regularly now, his education funded by another anonymous benefactor. Mary played with children from families whose fathers had found work with Harrison Shipping or similar enterprises that had sprung up around the former warehouse district. The land that had once been cursed with tragedy and supernatural corruption had become a source of renewal and hope, exactly as Father O'Malley had predicted. But Thomas never forgot the lesson of the jack-in-the-box and the spirits it had contained. Sometimes late at night when the tenement was quiet, he would listen carefully for sounds that didn't belong, for melodies that might carry messages from souls in need of peace. He had learned that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than most people realized, and that sometimes with courage and compassion, even a child could help bridge that gap and bring healing to wounds that had festered for decades. The jack-in-the-box was gone, crumbled to dust after fulfilling its sacred purpose, but the spirit of what it represented, the willingness to listen to the forgotten and help the helpless, had taken root in Thomas's heart and would guide him for the rest of his life. In the growing prosperity and peace of his family's new circumstances, Thomas found the greatest evidence that good could triumph over evil, that love could overcome corruption, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change the world in ways that rippled out far beyond what anyone could imagine. November 15th, 1899. Exactly 1 year after the supernatural events that had changed the McCarthy family forever, and 39 years since the original factory fire that had claimed 63 innocent lives, Thomas stood in the small cemetery behind St. Patrick's Cathedral, holding a wreath of white flowers that he and Mary had made together from materials purchased with money from Patrick's prosperous new job. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that made the whole city seem to sparkle with possibility. Before them stood a new monument, carved from white marble and bearing the names of every child who had died in the Ashford Match Factory fire. It had been commissioned by Harrison Shipping, whose owner had mysteriously decided that the victims of the old tragedy deserved proper recognition and remembrance. William Ashford, age 8, Thomas read aloud, running his fingers over the carved letters. Sarah McKenna, age 6, James O'Brien, age 9. He continued through the entire list, speaking each name with the reverence due to lives cut short by greed and negligence. Margaret and Patrick stood nearby, along with Father O'Malley, who had aged visibly over the past year but whose eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before. Mary held her father's hand, occasionally pointing at seemingly empty air and nodding as if listening to conversations only she could hear. "They're all here," Mary announced quietly. "All the children from the fire. They wanted to see their names carved in stone so people would remember them." Thomas felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced when the jack-in-the-box had blazed with blessed light. Though he could no longer see the spirits as clearly as he had that supernatural night, he could sense their presence, their gratitude, their peace. "Can they rest now?" Thomas asked Mary, knowing she would understand what he meant. Mary tilted her head, listening to voices only she could hear. Then she smiled, the pure, joyful expression of a child who had been given wonderful news. "William says yes. They can all rest now, but he also says they'll always be grateful to you, Tommy. And if other lost children ever need help, they'll make sure you know about it." Father O'Malley stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've given them something precious, my boy. You've given them dignity in death that they were denied in life. That's a rare gift and a sacred responsibility." The priest began to lead them in a prayer for the dead, his weathered voice carrying across the cemetery with newfound strength. As he spoke the familiar words, Thomas felt a subtle shift in the air around them, as if a great weight was finally being lifted from the very ground beneath their feet. After the prayer concluded, the family walked together through the transformed neighborhood that had once been the site of so much suffering. Where abandoned warehouses had stood just a year ago, new buildings now rose toward the sky. Harrison Shipping employed dozens of local men at fair wages. A school had opened for immigrant children, funded by the same mysterious benefactors who seemed to appear whenever the community needed help. Mrs. Kowalski's son Anton was thriving in his engineering studies. The Rossi family had moved into a larger apartment after the father found steady work as a foreman. Even old Mrs. Chen had been visited by relatives from California who had inexplicably decided to send money to help with her medical expenses. "It's like the whole neighborhood has been blessed," Margaret observed, as they walked past children playing safely in a new park that had been built where the most dangerous tenement buildings once stood. "It has been," Thomas replied, understanding now that the supernatural events of the previous November had been about more than just laying troubled spirits to rest. They had been about healing a wound in the fabric of the community itself, allowing hope and prosperity to flourish where despair and corruption had once taken root. As they reached their own building, Thomas noticed a familiar figure waiting on the front steps. It was a boy about his own age, but something about the way he held himself, the sadness in his eyes, suggested this wasn't an ordinary encounter. "Thomas," the boy said, his voice carrying just the faint echo that Thomas had learned to recognize. "My name is Daniel. I died in a mine collapse in Pennsylvania 5 years ago, but my spirit has been trapped there ever since. I heard about what you did for the factory children. Could you help me too?" Thomas looked back at his family, seeing understanding and encouragement in their faces. Mary nodded solemnly, while Patrick and Margaret each placed a supportive hand on his shoulders. "We'll figure it out together," Thomas said to the ghostly boy, feeling the weight and privilege of his supernatural calling settling around him like a mantle. No child should have to suffer alone, whether they're living or dead. As they climbed the stairs to their apartment, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day, when he'd discovered a mysterious jack-in-the-box in the ruins of an old warehouse. He was still 8 years old, still living in a crowded tenement with his family, still navigating the challenges of growing up poor in a big city. But he was also something more now. He was a bridge between worlds, a voice for the voiceless, a source of hope for spirits who had lost their way. The scars on his hands had faded, but the memory of that blessed fire would remain with him always, reminding him of his purpose and his power. That evening, as the family gathered around their table for dinner, Thomas quietly began planning his next supernatural mission. There were other trapped souls out there, other injustices waiting to be addressed, other children who needed someone to hear their stories and help them find peace. The jack-in-the-box was gone, reduced to dust after fulfilling its sacred purpose, but its legacy lived on in the boy who had been brave enough to listen to its message, compassionate enough to act on its plea for help, and faithful enough to believe that even the smallest person could make a difference in the world. Outside their window, the lights of New York City twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life, a story, a dream. And Thomas McCarthy, armed with hard-won wisdom and supernatural purpose, was ready to help write new chapters in the ongoing story of hope triumphing over darkness, love conquering fear, and the living standing up for the dead who could no longer speak for themselves. The anniversary had passed peacefully. The dead were finally at rest, and a new generation of protectors was ready to take up the sacred task of healing the wounds between worlds. In the distance, a church bell chimed 9 times, marking the end of another day and the beginning of countless new possibilities.